How did Christians get the doctrine of the virgin birth? Counter-apologist Paulogia says it was a mixture of Matthew's creativity and stupidity. Here's Paulogia.
Now in Isaiah 7, the Jewish nation was still divided into two kingdoms, not unlike Korea is today, the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. In this chapter, Israel had formed an alliance with the foreign power Samaria. So God sent his servant Isaiah to warn the king of Judah with a promise of a sign that God would protect them. This sign of a son that is further described in the next verses.
For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste.
We don't hear that part in the Christmas pageants. The Bible records that this sign was fulfilled a few verses later in Isaiah 8 verses 3-4. A child of very natural conception is born to Isaiah, and the enemies of Judah were vanquished before he spoke his first words. Given that the passage is very much a self-contained narrative story that makes no mention at all of the future Messiah, one might wonder why the Christians view this passage as prophetic, when Jewish rabbis certainly did not.
Now I gotta admit, Paul has a point. How would it be good news to King Ahaz that a child would be born 700 years later? Don't we see the fulfillment of the prophecy in chapter 8? But let's consider the wider context of Isaiah 7-11. The northern kingdom was planning on kicking Ahaz off the throne, and they were going to replace him with their own guy. Ahaz represents the house of David, and God promised to keep a son of David on the throne. The entire dynasty is in jeopardy. So Isaiah tells Ahaz to ask for a sign. Unbelieving Ahaz says no, so God gives him his own sign. A baby named Emmanuel would be born. The child would be born within a few years, and while he's young, defeat will come for Israel's enemies. But here's the weird thing. Who exactly is Emmanuel? Paulogia doesn't mention this, but many scholars believe that it was a son of Ahaz to replace his doubting dad. This would preserve David's line. But Emmanuel's birth isn't mentioned in Isaiah. We're just left hanging. Paulogia says Isaiah's son is the child by whom the prophetic clock is set. Fair enough, but how exactly did it get changed to that? We're just not told. But what is clear is that in chapter 9 of Isaiah, there is a son from David's line who is given divine honors. And in chapter 11, this king will rule the nations forever. So no, I don't think Matthew is taking things out of context. Now you might complain about Matthew's interpretation methods, but they are in line with the Jewish interpretations of the time. Typology was one type of fulfilled prophecy. According to New Testament scholar Craig Evans, because biblical exegesis in the early Jewish and Christian period was founded on the belief that Scripture contained the ever-relevant will of God, every effort was made to bring its teaching to bear upon the contemporary world and concerns of the believing community. This effort lies behind all interpretive methods, including typology. Jesus being the Emmanuel is a fulfillment of that typology. Typology, Evans says, represents the effort to coordinate past and present and future according to major events, persons, and institutions of Scripture. So with that historical background out of the way, let's get to the crux of Paulogia's argument, the word almah.
Indeed, some Christians do enjoy citing parallels as if they are prophecies, but how did this prediction that was satisfactorily fulfilled with a very natural conception in the Old Testament come to be extrapolated to require a miraculous conception in the future? Which brings us back to that footnote on Isaiah 7:14. It indicates that in this context, virgin might actually mean young woman in the original Hebrew. If this is a messianic prophecy, why did the translators feel necessary to acknowledge another interpretation? While the Gospel of Matthew, along with the entire New Testament, was written in Greek, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. As such, when the author of Matthew included quotations from the Old Testament, he used the Greek translation known as the Septuagint, much like an English writer today would use the King James, ESV, NIV, or some other translation rather than the Hebrew text directly. In the Septuagint, the noun used to reference the woman in Isaiah 7:14 is parthenos, which generally, though not always, means virgin, specifically describing a woman who has not yet had sexual relations. But if one goes back to the original Hebrew source, the word found there is almah, which is not the specific word for virgin. So, for whatever the reason may have been, the Septuagint translator of Isaiah chose parthenos to translate almah. He chose a word that usually means virgin to translate a word that sometimes means virgin. Not technically wrong, but perhaps a touch imprecise. If Isaiah had wanted to be clear about this virgin factor, he could have and should have used bethulah instead.
So, does this show that Matthew is a doofus that didn't understand Hebrew? Nah, I don't think so. The word almah occurs only 6 other times in the Old Testament. In Genesis 24, Rebekah was Isaac's promised bride. In the same chapter, she's called a girl, Na'ara, in 24:14. She's also called a virgin, bethulah, in verse 16, and a maiden, almah, in 24:43. All three words describe a virginal young woman. In Exodus 2:8, Miriam's sister Moses is an almah. She's living at home with her parents, so it's pretty easy to infer she's still a virgin. Now, in Psalm 46:1, Psalm 68:25, and 1 Chronicles 15:20, the use of the word is indeterminate. But in Song of Solomon 1:3, the verse refers to almah in the plural for Solomon. These are not married women, but maidens who wanted husbands, so the term implies virginity. And then in Song of Solomon 6:8, there are three categories of women that are described: 60 queens, 80 concubines, and almah in the plural without measure. These are wife or concubine candidates. In other words, the king had a supply of virgins. And then we have Proverbs 30. In verse 19, it describes a way of a man with his almah. In the context, when we look at Proverbs 30:18 through 20, it refers to four incomprehensible things: an eagle in the sky, a serpent on a rock, a ship at sea, and a man with an almah. What do all four things have in common? They are all things that disappear fast. An eagle flies away from sight, a serpent slithers off the rock, a ship disappears, and well, a virgin can lose her virginity in a heartbeat. Now, I'm no Hebrew scholar, and in Paulogia's video, he has Dr. Josh of Digital Hammurabi discuss the word almah, and he gives a pretty fair and even-handed treatment of it. Definitely feel free to watch Paulogia's entire video in the description down below. But Dr. Michael Heiser also has a PhD in Semitic languages and the Hebrew Bible. In the description, I'll link an article and a lecture where he draws the same conclusion that I do. But Heiser argues that we don't need a fancy word study when a little common sense will do the job. Here's Dr. Heiser.
Point is that almah, when a Hebrew Israelite, when an Israelite, someone familiar with the Hebrew Bible, when they saw the word almah, heard it or read it, they certainly had the category possibility of virgin for that word. Now they know their own language well enough to know that it might not be virgin, but it is absolutely incorrect to say that it cannot be, that meaning cannot be part of that word. Now, let's do a little practical thinking here. Scholars are not necessarily known for their logic all the time. I once made the comment in a graduate seminar class that I thought a course in logic should be required for every graduate student in biblical studies. I didn't make many friends that day, but I believe it. Let's do a little thinking. Okay, I have 4 children. I have 3 daughters and 1 boy. My daughters are 17, 15, and the youngest is a daughter. She's 8. Now, in a patriarchal culture, in the Semitic culture, a woman was of marriageable age when she hit puberty, because now you can start having babies, okay? And that's 12, 13, 14, somewhere in the early teens. I have 2 almahs. They're young women of marriageable age, and they just happen to be virgins because I'm a ruthless patriarch. Okay? Now I say that because if in today's culture, unless we're going to conclude that every girl after the age of 12 is not a virgin, that's what you'd have to say for Spong to be right. That kind of absurdity. Unless you're going to say that, which would be totally obvious, you've got to conclude that, hey, a lot of almahs, a lot of women of marriageable age, they're still virgins. Yeah, they are. And in a patriarchal culture like in the Old Testament, where they really did exercise a very tight control over their daughters, that number would probably even be higher. Okay, so again, just simple logic tells you that when a Semite thought of almah, he didn't think, yeah, a woman that can get married now and she's not a virgin either. It's just stupid. Okay, it's just not. It doesn't conform to the reality of the culture, and it doesn't conform to the reality of the text either.
So there you have it. To say that a virgin birth derives from a misunderstanding of the Hebrew is, well, a misunderstanding in itself. But what about Matthew being overeager to hype up Jesus' messianic credentials? Here's Paulogia one last time.
Jump ahead to the world of the 1st century, shortly after the death of Jesus, and the stories about him being the Messiah are spreading. The Greek speakers of the day are looking at prophecies in the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament and innocently interpreting the plain reading of Isaiah as an unfulfilled promise of a virgin birth. Is it possible that in a well-meaning effort to bolster the claims that Jesus was the Messiah, that the author of Matthew, or perhaps earlier oral traditions, exaggerated the birth story of Jesus to line up with this ambiguous Greek translation? After all, this idea is never mentioned by the earlier writings of Paul nor in the earlier written Gospel of Mark. It has all the markings of a late addition to the story.
So, from Paul's cynical perspective, Matthew invented the stories to fit the misunderstood prophecies. But we can easily turn Paulogia's argument on its head. He is right about one thing. Isaiah 7:14 wasn't thought to be messianic by any Jewish reader. There's not a scrap of evidence for it, and we have piles of evidence on that front. Scholar Alfred Edersheim lists 456 messianic passages from the Talmud and Targums. Isaiah 7:14 doesn't make the cut. There's just no reason an early 1st century Messianic Jew would feel the urge to reach for it, especially when they have plenty of other material to work with. So why would Matthew feel moved to draw from this particular passage? I have a theory on this. Hear me out. Actual events suggested the parallels. New Testament scholar Mark Goodacre is as even-handed as a scholar as they come. No one would ever accuse him of being some sort of hyper-conservative. He agrees that the virgin birth didn't originate from a bad translation. He argues that the critics have it exactly backward. Here's Goodacre.
The thesis that the story emerges out of a mistranslation of Isaiah kind of presumes that Matthew doesn't have any other source for this tradition. It's a little bit like John Dominic Crossan's prophecy historicized model, about which I talked in a previous episode of the NT Pod. The idea that what the evangelists did is they searched the Old Testament scriptures and found things for Jesus to fulfill. Now, the problem with that theory when it comes to the birth narratives is that quite often the scriptures, the prophecies, if you like, that Matthew is choosing aren't always fantastically appropriate. They don't look like things that he has pulled out of the Old Testament and then wound a story around. I think far more likely than a sort of prophecy historicized case is a case of tradition scripturalized. I know scripturalization is a bit of an ugly word, and I've talked about it a little bit before. But what I think is going on quite often in Matthew is that he has a tradition which he's looking to find some kind of scriptural justification for. And this is one of those things. I think that the tradition at least predates Matthew, some kind of tradition of Jesus being born out of wedlock. And what he's trying to do is trying to find some sort of scriptural basis for this tradition that he's repeating. So what I would call it is a kind of tradition scripturalized. He's got the tradition, but he's looking to find ways in which he can express it using the evocative language of the Old Testament. And one of the reasons I think that he goes to Isaiah 7 as well is because he so loves the language there about Emmanuel, God with us. That's one of the things that's going to be key in Matthew's gospel. In fact, he wraps his whole gospel around this idea of God with us. We have God with us prophesied in chapter 1 here in the story of the virginal conception, and then at the end of Matthew's gospel, we have Jesus saying to the disciples, "Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So that's why Matthew draws in this Isaiah 7:14 thing. It's not because he's kind of looking for some sort of thing that he can spin a story out of. It's much more that it's a scripturalization of something that's already in his way of telling the story.
Goodacre says that Jesus was born out of wedlock, and so Matthew needs to explain this fact. Goodacre doesn't say whether he believes a miracle occurred or not. The listener is left to decide for themselves. But if Matthew met Jesus' mother, don't you think he'd be just a little bit curious about Jesus' childhood? So we can't rule out Mary as the source for Matthew's gospel. Now, I believe there are very good reasons to think that Matthew wrote Matthew, and that is one big, if true, statement. As an apostle, I'm sure he got to meet Jesus' mother, since she was a part of the upper room experience in Acts along with the other 11. And to say that the virgin birth isn't explicitly mentioned in Paul's letters in Mark's gospel, so therefore they didn't believe in the virgin birth, really is an argument from silence, and it does beg the question against the reliability of Matthew and Luke. But either way, Paulogia is wrong. The virgin birth didn't originate because the writer of Matthew didn't understand Hebrew. And Matthew didn't pull the story out of thin air just to make Jesus seem more impressive. He knew of the story and the wider context of Isaiah 7 through 11, and he found Jesus there.